Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share my MoonDrops Pendant with you. If we pop down to the board now, I'll show you a little bit more closely what it is we're going to work together today. So I have a couple of examples of the MoonDrops Pendant, and this idea came about primarily because I had lots of little odd scraps of chain and I wanted to be able to use them in something other than earrings. Not everybody wants long dangly earrings. I admit I quite am fond of a shoulder grazer. But you can utilise even odd bits or very, very short pieces. On this one I've joined two separate types of chain together, just to make something a bit more visually appealing. On this one there are two different types of chain, and on this one there are also two different types of chain, but in a silver colourway. So what you can do with this design is size it up for wall art, size it down if you want to have that as a pair of earrings perhaps. If you've got lots of tiny scraps of chain, it's a really useful way to do it. They've got a beautiful fluidity of movement to them with that chain coming away from the bottom. We don't use a huge amount of wire for this project either, and it is accessible to people who are newer to wire work. So why don't we move these out of the way and get cracking, making some MoonDrops pendants together today. I might just leave this one in the corner because it shows up quite nicely on the camera with that hot copper colourway. Let's just pop him there. Lovely. So our main section of wire that we're going to use to create the moon shape together today is going to be 12 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Now if you're making this for wall art, or indeed if you just want a slightly sturdier pendant, you can absolutely size that up to 1.25mm 16 gauge for the frame that which is where we're going to start. So again, this is 12 inches, and I'm going to warm that between thumb and forefinger to make sure that that's nice and smooth and fluid. So this has got a bit of a kink in it because it's been knocking around on my desk, so I'm taking a couple of extra moments just to get that nice and smooth. And around 1/3 of the way from the end is where we're going to start today. So what I want to do is start with the first horn of the moon. So I'm going to make a right angle to begin with. And if I pop this into the orientation, you've got 1/3 of the wire going straight up, and then 2/3 of the wire coming out on your dominant side. So you may wish to invert this if you're south dominant, if you are left-handed rather than right-handed. Just swap that into the alternative direction and work in a mirror image. So I'm right dominant, I'm going to go this way, otherwise things aren't going to go well for me. So we're going to start by creating the first horn of the design. And I'm going to use my my bent chain nose pliers to go underneath. You can use any flat pliers that you like. Tapered tip are really handy to get in nice and tight. I'm just going to push the wire back on itself like so that we're getting the first horn of that moon. We're up at the top on the right hand side at the moment. So I'm going to just give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to get some nice strength into that to begin with. And what we're going to do now is bring in a round form. I've got my trusty wooden mandrel that I've had for thousands of years, or at least it feels like it, and I'm going to push the long tail of the wire over the top to create the inner size of that moon shape. So if I just draw that down a little bit and then pop it onto the desk, you'll be able to see that we're just creating the inside section to begin with. Now, one of the reasons that we always warm the wire first is that it may possibly be we'll need to move the location of this upright later. The reason I put it in at the beginning of the tutorial is so that we have a good idea of the size of the moon we're going to create. It may be that we need to move that slightly towards the horn of the moon just here. So I'm going to use my hands just to smooth the wire around. I'm using the curvature of my finger and the heat of my body to generate a little bit of smoothness, and we're going to create the second horn of the moon now. I'm going to grip hold of the wire again from underneath and push the wire back away in the same direction that it came from. Now again, I'm just going to pop a little bit of warmth and fluidity, a little bit of strengthening, the opposite of warmth and fluidity. We're going for coldness and hardness instead. So giving that a bit of a squish and a squeeze just to get that to sit where I want it to. Now for the design I'm showing you over on the right hand side, the example design, we've got 3 small loops to create, and for this design to work seamlessly I'm going to add the chain in as we go through. Now this means that it will be a bit more of a handful as you're working, but what it does mean is that you don't have any jump rings, and jump rings generate points of weakness in a design. If you find this super tricky, do use good quality saw cut jump rings to attach your chain later. So I'm just going to invert the design for a moment. We're still looking at the uppermost face of it, it's just upside down to its final position. And I'm going to start coercing the wire around using my thumb just to get an idea of the size of the moon that we're going to work with today. So I'm just going to give that a bit of a pull to make sure I'm happy with the kind of shape we're working with. Now if you prefer, let me just flip this back around for a second, you can have the horns of your moon in exactly the same line, or as I have, you can have them slightly tilted. I kind of like it when it's slightly tilted and the lower horn is further out to the right. It just has a nice relaxed look to it. So let's flip this upside down again, and we're going to make our first loop now. Popping in with those round nose pliers, I'm going to get far over past where the point of that upright is, and pretty close to where the uppermost horn of the moon comes around. So I'm going to pull the wire all the way around that round nose, and I'm going to start rotating the form so that I can get a good round shape. Now what will happen sometimes is your wire won't sit where you want it to. Part of that is because I'm showing this in the flat, whereas you can hold this up to your face if you desire. So I'm just going to smooth the wire away for a second, and then I'm going to pop those pliers back in a slightly different position and just open and close them very gently until the wire that continues along its merry way sits flush with the first line that we've created from the lower horn onwards. What we want to have, now if I just bring a stunt moon in for a second, what we want to have is the appearance of a nice smooth line that comes around the outside and the lower edges of that moon. Now to do that with the loops, you just need to focus a little bit to ensure that your incoming wire matches with your outgoing wire. So another thing that I want to point out at this stage is that when I'm creating this design, I like to have the wire looping around, coming over the top, and then repeating the same again for the next 2 loops. What this means is that your wire gradually comes further forwards. So because you're going around a little bit like a multi-storey car park, you're going around in a circuit, and coming up you're then 2 millimeters, because this is a 1 millimeter gauge wire, you're a millimeter higher than where you started. By the time you get to the end you'll be 3 millimeters higher. So another thing that you need to look out for is to just very gently draw that wire down a little bit so that if you pop it on a board it's flush again. So the wire has come around, done a loop-de-loop, and it comes over the top, and then it gently smooths its way back to the flat surface. If you don't, what you will end up with is a slightly more 3D variation, which is absolutely fine. If you're happy with that, you go for that, but it's just something to look out for. So I'm going to smooth the wire again and just draw that around, get a little bit of shaping to it as if it's going to continue before I pop those round nose pliers in again, draw the wire all the way around, and I'm going to do this far too far apart. I want to have 3 loops on my moon. If I find that I make the loop far too far over in this direction, I'm going to show you how to fix that now, because it does happen. So here's our loop. If we were to continue around and create a 3rd loop up here, what would happen is that one chain would hang over the other, so you need your loops to be quite close together. So what I'm going to do is just pop the round nose pliers into that loop shape and rotate that around until the loop sits where I want it to. So I'm just moving that around a couple of times. The loop is now much closer to the first one. So again, I'm going to just pop the pliers in the opposite direction, push the outgoing wire. So for each form we have an incoming wire, loop-de-loop and an outgoing wire. Now because I've reformed it, that's kicked up ever so slightly, and I'm going to show you how to fix that as well. So first thing I'm going to do is put a lot of warmth into the wire that we're working with today. I'm working with raw copper, which I absolutely love. And what we need to do is just get that super fluid again, so that the continuation of wire, the outgoing wire, is following the path that we want it to follow. And you'll see again that the wire is slightly larger in the second loop than it is in the first loop. So all I'm going to do is just pinch that ever so slightly until it sits how and where I want it to. So it's difficult to show you up above, but if I tilt that on the side, I'm just going to push the wire down again, and you'll see that we're getting towards that moon shape with some loop-de-loops in there. The wire is slightly mangled here from where we moved it around, so all I'm going to do is take a hold of that single outgoing wire. I'm not gripping it where the two wires cross over. I'm just going to give that a little bit of a gentle straighten before bringing that back down into position. So I'm happy that we fixed that. You may prefer to use your flat facing pliers just to get the loops to sit exactly where you want them to. So I now need to add my third loop into position. If you want to add your chain in, what you will need to do is open the loops out. Should really do it after each time you create a loop, but I forgot, so I'm going to open that out now and show you how you can anyway. So I've got some scrap chains here. I've got 2 short lengths of black chain, which I've had hanging around for donkey's years, and then I've got a piece left over from another project, which is part 1-in-1 chainmail and a very tiny residue of a chain reaction chain, much the same as the piece I have on the demonstration moon over on the side. So I'm going to start with a black chain. And what I've done is I've gently opened out those loops. If you add the chain every time you create a loop, it's much easier, but I'm going to show you how to fix that as well. So slide the chain down, ride that all the way around the loop-de-loop, and then into the next piece. So even if you forget to add your chain until you've made the third loop, you can still fix that. Once you've added the chain into that loop, can you see there's a tiny gap up at the top there? You need to close that up again, and it's very easy to do, just pressing gently. I'm hardly using any pressure at all. I'm using my pliers because it's easier for you to see. So we've got the second loop in position, so I'm going to add the odd piece of chain. If you've got 2 identical and 1 odd, it's nice to put the odd one in the middle. And again, you'll be able to see if I tilt the piece like so, that there's a gap in that loop. So if I just squash that together, you can see, because I'm working with warmed copper wire, that reacts really, really nicely to a very sensible, sensitive little touch. So I'm going to show you how to make the third loop and then bring the wire around to the top. So you may need to just make sure that your incoming wire is matched up with your outgoing wire after you've added your chain. So I'm just going to pinch that like so, pinch that like so, and I'm really happy with that nice smooth form that's moving through. So again, if you warm your wire before you work it, you will end up with much nicer, smoother results. So we're back to those round nose pliers now, and I'm going to start a little bit closer, start turning the wire around, and then draw the tail over the top. And if you just make small movements, you'll be able to get that loop into the correct position without having to fix it retrospectively. You just take small movements, one bit at a time. You'll soon find that you can create on the fly without too much drama. So I'm really happy with where that loop is sat. So I'm going to add my third section of scrap chain in. If you haven't opened your loop, what will happen is the chain will get stuck. The easy way to open that up is just to tilt it as if it was a jump ring. So I'm just going to tilt that open slightly. That should be enough of an aperture to get this relatively fine curb chain through, and then push that back down so that it fits. If I pop this into its proper orientation for a second, you'll be able to see that we're getting towards where we want to get to next. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons for this design is because I wanted to use up scraps of chain. I'm very often left with just tiny little bits, not quite useful enough to make a whole piece of jewellery by themselves. You can of course make charm drops for extenders on necklaces and bracelets, but sometimes it's nice, if you've got pretty chain, to use it in something a little bit more effective. So let's go back down to the board and we'll move on to the next stage of the tutorial. So I'm going to continue forming the wire around the back side of that moon. And again, you'll need to make sure that that loop sits exactly where you want it to. So you might need to just close that very carefully, very gently when you're pressing down on 2 passes of wire, making sure that your incoming wire, loop-de-loop, matches the same line as your outgoing wire. So bringing that all the way around in a nice, smooth, swooshing fashion. We're going to just pop this down on the board for a second and have a look at where we put that first upright in. Now, if you prefer to, you don't have to put that upright in to begin with. What can happen when you create your shape, and I'm bringing in a stunt moon without any loops on it, is that you can put the upright, which becomes a very simple wrapped loop bale, too far over to the left. It looks weird if you do it, and it doesn't balance properly. So what we're going to do is just lay the wire over the top. That tail of wire is going to go over the top, and we're going to assess how we think that's going to look. So I think that my upright is too far over to the left and that it won't hang nicely. We want the balance point to be somewhere between the first loop and the second loop, rather than just right above that central loop. So what we're going to do is just draw this wire forwards and out of the way so that visually you're able to see better. And I'm going to very, very carefully flatten down that first angle that we made. And because we warmed the wire, we have the opportunity to do this without too much risk. And then I'm going to put some lovely warmth back into it, and we're going to move that over slightly. Now, practicing this design is really handy. I have several of them now, just to get it right. I did make several attempts, and I'm going to move that upright bend over so it's a little bit closer. Yeah, that's now about halfway between the first loop and the second loop, which actually I think will balance really nicely. So what I'm going to do now is just coerce the wire back flat down, like so. And what we're going to do is a wrapped loop with the shorter tail of wire coming over that upright form. Now, sometimes when you're wrapping a 1mm or 18 gauge wire around another 1mm or 18 gauge wire, if I take this tail and start moving it around, what can happen is that I'll start eating into the wire over on this side. And as I've decided that I wanted my shape to be thus, I don't want that to change. So a cool way of getting that in the correct formation is to hold your pliers on the tail wire that's coming over at the point where you want the bend, the first bend to occur, and then push down whilst gripping and take it all the way around the end. So if I bring this upwards towards the camera, you can see we've come all the way around the upright and back in the same direction. It's quite a loose loop at the moment, so we're going to tighten that up before we do anything else. Now, what will happen quite often when you're squishing down a loop like this is that this tail of wire will just move this way and it will come up instead of flat because it's the path of least resistance. So if we pinch together the back of the moon form and that tail and carefully apply a little bit of pressure just to fine up that loop. If I tilt that back to the camera, you can see it's a much snugger fit. So I'm then going to pinch very firmly the horn of the moon and the back of the moon whilst I bring that tail around a couple of times. So just push the wire around. If it's warm, it will work better for you. And I'm going to go for maybe 3 or 4 wraps. I think that's quite a nice moon shape. If you do start eating into this wire accidentally, I'm going to show you a quick fix. So if I just trim this tail of wire a little bit longer than I normally would, and I'm going to keep this section because it will be handy for our next stage of the tutorial. What I'm going to do is just push the end of the tail down so that it sits against that upright, and then I'm going to undo. So quite often when I'm making a coil of wire on a strong central section, smooth, I will take my pliers and I will rotate them, like so, in the direction of the end of the wire. Well, today I'm going to undo that. So I'm going to pinch the assembly together very firmly, go in the opposite direction, and you'll see that you get a slightly mangled bit of wire just here. Well, you can take a second to get that to sit exactly where you want it to, flatten it back out, and you'll get a bit more of the wire back that accidentally went round that upright. So it's a really handy little tip to know that you can, if you're warming your wire before you work it, kind of undo it a stage sometimes. It doesn't always work, but I think we've made a good rescue on that one. So let's just pop this down on the board for a second and look where we are at. Obviously with scraps of chain you can cut them further down, you can add a little rosary linking at the bottom. If you've got the odd crystal that doesn't match anything, you can add some of those on with a head pin, whatever you fancy doing. So if I show you end on the loops, just drop that down into the focus zone. What will happen is that the height of the outgoing wire is higher, so you do need to take a second, as I have done, to just smooth the wire back down so that when you pop this on a flat plane it will all sit neatly, like so. So I'm going to show you a very quick wrapped loop up at the top now. You've seen it several times before, but a very quick little wrapped loop bale. If you want to, what you can do instead of trimming away this is bring 2 shoulders up and go for a woven bale. You've always got options open to you. Now, whereas normally what I would do is leave a space between the top of the coil that we created and where I take the bend of wire forwards rather, what I'm going to do today is bend the wire forwards at the top of that coil, because we're going to create a double coil on this tiny little neck section, and in that way we're building up strength. So if you have bale makers, they're really handy to use for making bales. If you don't, you can use a round form such as a pen, or you can use the very, very lowest part of your round nose pliers. So I'm going to use step number 4, draw the tail all the way around, bring that through so that you have a classic wrapped loop shape. And I'm just going to give that a squish and a squeeze to make sure that that sits where I want it to. I'm going to flip the design over. You can see that the tail of the wire has come all the way around. It's not particularly round because I just mashed it slightly. I'm going to hold that loop of wire that we've created and draw the tail all the way around, double wrapping over the coil that came from the top of the moon shape. Pass that back over the front and then drop it down to the board. So we've now got a really nice strong neck section beneath the bale connecting to our MoonDrops pendant. We've also got about 1.25 inches left over, which you can turn into a coil and sit over the face of that neck if you like. I will show you that just now. Give that a little bit of extra heat and warmth. It's seen some action now, so it's a little bit tense. Take the very tip of your pliers and start rotating that wire around. Once you get into that loop shape, you can start pushing that into either the forefinger or the thumb of your non-dominant hand, depends which way you're rotating, and draw that coil all the way to the double wrapped neck section. If I pop this back into its original orientation, you will see I've brought that coil to the centre. It's sticking out at a funny angle, so what we're going to do is pull that up and use it to cover part of the bale and that double wrapped loop. I think it's quite a nice effect. If you have extra wire on the end, you can make a super huge coil and then your threading material seems to disappear behind a coil. It's like a hidden setting, which is really cool. So for the next stage of our tutorial today, I'm going to be delving into the ubiquitous scrap pot. Now, you always hear me talking about put it in the scrap pot when there's like barely a couple of inches of that wire. Well, today's the day that you get to use up not just your scrap chain, but you also get to use up your scrap lengths of wire. You could use a 0.820 gauge if you preferred, but my preference would be to use the same wire as the frame. So if you're working with 18 gauge 1mm, use those scraps up. If you're working with the heavier gauge because you're making wall art, then do try and keep the same gauge of wire for the infill, which is where we're going next. So in my demonstration pieces, I have added 3 scrolls. I've done this one quite quickly to show up in copper on the board, so I haven't connected all of the scrolls fully, but I did connect all of the scrolls in the silver example. So I'll just pop that on the back of my hand, on the front of my hand so you can see the scrolls better. I have 3 S-type scrolls. The one in the centre is fairly symmetrical in its sizes. The one at the top and the bottom have a smaller shape on one end and much more coiling on the other. So it will really depend on the shape of the moon that you've made. Let's just bring the third example in for a second. And again, these are just using scraps of wire in the same gauge as the framework. So let's pop those out of the way. One thing I would say is check that both of your ends on your scrap are flush. Quite often they're discarded in a hurry and you'll have the sharp side, so do make sure that those are both cut. And I tend to start in the middle This is a scrap length of wire that's just shy of 3 inches. So let's move our frame just over to the side for a second. And I'm going to start by creating a bit of an S shape. Now, you do want the very end of the wire to sit flush to the next circuit. But rather than creating closed coils like we did up at the top here, we're going to create a much more open design. And that is because we want to be able to get our finer gauge wire in to wrap around these sections. And you can't do that when the wire is too close together. So I've started off on one end by creating a little bit of an open coil. What I'm going to do now, because it's an S-shaped scroll, is I need to ensure that I'm going to be wrapping the other tail in the opposite direction. So you're looking at a Z or an S shape, whichever way you want to think about it. So if I bring the end of my pliers to the end of the wire scrap and start rotating that around, the reason I say about keeping the cut end of the wire against the rest of the coil that's going around it is because it's less things to catch on in wear. So I'm going to make sure that that's flat. I want it to be completely 2D, or as 2D as it can be, before I start coiling from the other end. Now, you don't have to have them completely symmetrical, but what you do need to have is enough size so that it meets both sides of your frame. So I'm going to just bring this around a little bit further. If you struggle with creating coils freehand by just using the wire's flexibility, you can manually do it by using the tip of a fine pair of flat facing pliers. So here what I'm doing is generating a scroll shape by just moving the wire through very, very tiny movements. It will never be quite as smooth as a freehand looped section. Let's try that for size. Well, what do you know, that actually fits perfectly. That may be the first time that's happened in my life. So what I would say is you need 3 points of connection between your scroll and your frame. So if you're going to connect here on the nice smooth side of the scroll, I'd also connect here and then at least one other point. So let's talk about the wire that we're going to use to hold that together. Because it's a very functional wire, I'm going to use 24 gauge, which is equivalent to 0.5mm. I tend to work with scraps. I don't have any scraps today because I used them all up yesterday preparing the demonstration piece. So I've just cut around about 5 inches of that 0.5mm or 24 gauge wire, and what we're going to do now is join the scroll to the frame. So if I pick the whole assembly up and make sure that I'm happy with how this is sitting, what I'm going to do is pinch very, very firmly, and I'm going to just pick somewhere to start off. Now on the frame wire you need at least 3 coils, 3 turns of wire with the finer gauge wire to make it nice and stable and secure. But on the bit where you're connecting the scroll to the frame, it's really whatever number fits in the design. So this is quite broad. There's quite a long space where the 2 wires sit flush. So I may be able to get 5 wraps. So I'm going to take the end of the wire and I'm going to post that down inside the scroll and just lay it in place for a second. And then I'm going to bring the tail over the top. So I'm not worrying about the wire that's trailing away to the left at the moment. I'm going to start working towards the right. I'm right dominant, it's best for me. I'm going to bring the tail of the wire down and underneath and back up inside that scroll. Now when you're working with ever so slightly heavier wire, so normally when I'm weaving I'll work with a 0.4 or 26 gauge. I'm choosing to work with a slightly heavier wire for 2 reasons. First of all, it requires a little more strength and we want this to last for a long time. So adding just a tiny extra amount of wire diameter is really helpful. Also, if you warm 0.4mm gauge wire, which is equivalent to 26 gauge, too many times, it will simply snap. It doesn't like it overly much. You've got a tiny bit more flexibility with the ever so slightly heavier gauge wire, which is what we're using now. So I'm simply tying the scroll to the frame, and I think I'm going to wrap around 5 times to hold those 2 together. So I'm going to push the wire little coil selection along until I'm happy with how that looks. I've done 4 so far, pretty sure we need another one. So bringing the wire up inside that scroll. If you struggle, You can employ your tools, just go slowly and gently and the wire will comply. If you yank that through really hard, it's not going to last very, very long. You'll put too much stress on the wire. So I've got 5 wraps around the scroll and the frame. So in order to make this nice and secure, you will always tie off around a single section of wire. So what I'm doing now is putting the tail up just inside the frame. That's 1 and that's 2. And then we're going to bring that last section up inside the moon-shaped frame, over the top and around. So we can see we've got 3 visible wraps around just the frame wire. You can tighten those coils up very, very carefully. What we want to do now is just flip over to the back. Now I want the wire end to be inside that frame. That is the point at which it will cause less drama. If it's on the front, it looks unattractive. If it's on the back, it could scratch your skin. So I'm going to cut that just past, a tiny, tiny, tiny hair's breadth over the top of that frame wire. And then I'm going to chase that around until the cut end sits smoothly against the frame. You do need to have a gentle hand, a little bit of control. Otherwise what you can do is deform the frame itself. So if we flip that back to the front, you can see that we're nice and neat and tidy. So I've got the tail on the other end to contend with now. So I could theoretically, if I wanted to, go for a few more passes around that scroll. The scroll will move while it's only attached by 1 point of contact. So before you get too strong with your wire connections, you'll want to make sure that's sitting in the correct position. It's really handy that it's done that. And then I'm going to take the tail now 3 times around just that frame wire. So push that all the way through. Bring the tail round. If it's easier to use tools, then do. Make sure that that coil is nice and neat and tidy. And then I'm going to push the tail of the wire again inside just the moon-shaped frame. Pull that into position. And then we're going to end up with a 3rd visible wrap. So what we need to do, we're just a smidge past where the wire goes over the surface of that frame. I'm going to take that tail of wire away out of shot, and then we just need to push that cut end down so that it sits inside the frame wire neatly. So you can see the wire has come over the top and the cut end is just here. So I'm moving in this direction with my pliers to get that smooth and tight to the frame. You will then need to find another 2 points of contact. So as I said earlier, your scroll will wiggle about until you set it fully. So I'm just going to move that up slightly and show you where I will apply the same process again. I'm not going to show you again because it's exactly the same thing. You've got a little space here where you can attach your scroll to the frame wire. Now what you'll notice is that you're quite close to one of the loops. If that means that you need to, let me just flip the design over, wrap 3 times around the lower half of the loop, you absolutely can. You'll just need to wrap 3 times first and then push that ever so slightly so that it sits neatly behind the design. Flip back to the front and then you can wrap 3 or 5 times on this section where the scroll is against the frame, and then finish with 3 wraps on the other side. Then you would choose another point of contact. If you want to wrap up 4 points, then please do. When it comes to infilling on the other sections, the horns of the moon, you can do this with quite a tiny scrap. This is barely over 1.25 inches. I'm not going to wrap it in because it gets very close, a tiny bit tricky to see on camera, but what I would do is just show you how you might create a shape to fit in there. So I'm making a loop on one end. Again, the same rule applies. You need to make sure that the cut end of the wire fits against the swooshing wire that passes around it so that there's less likelihood of that catching. You've still got space to attach this with 3 passes of wire. If you can only get 2 passes of wire around this loop and the frame, that's absolutely fine. If you can only get 1, do you know what? It'll be fine. Just do 3 wraps either side on the frame and all will be well with the world. On the other end, you'll need a slightly wider piece, won't you, to fit into the frame itself. You might like to have a slightly larger aperture to begin with. So that's what it would look like if you had a big loop in the centre. Flatten that down, making sure that the cut end sits snugly against the wire. And what I'm going to do is just get that to circle around like a swan. Again, if you struggle with that, what you can do is manually form that arcing shape just by drawing your pliers around in very small motions. So let's see if that would fit in the horn of the moon. Give it a bit of a squish and a squeeze. It does look a bit like an upside down duck at this stage. Pop that into position. So that's going to fit really neatly into the upper portion of this crescent moon shape. Same logic applies. If you want to band the pieces, the infill scrolls together, you can. You don't have to, as long as you've got 3 points of contact. So for the upper horn, I would go for the closed side of the small loop attached to the inside of the upper horn, and then also here and also here up at the top. So do that again, but at the bottom. Until that gets locked in, it's going to keep waggling around, but you've got another moon there. I'm just going to show you the other examples and clear the detritus from my desk. So as I said, this is a project for using up scraps. It's a thrifty project. And then let's bring that other piece in, and then I'll tidy up the chain so you can see all of them side by side, albeit this one isn't completed. The same processes that we've learnt together will be applied to just finish that off. So let me just rest that over the top with the funny duck shape. There you go, you've got your little chains coming down. I think they're beautiful, and I think they're a really useful way to just use up your last few scraps. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed our thrifty MoonDrops Pendant project today. If you've liked the content, please do drop me a like. Consider subscribing to the channel. I really only do jewellery on a Sunday. That's when my videos come up normally. There may be the odd extra here and there, but I don't bombard you with lots and lots of rot, so it's all good. Have a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.